Yes, again, as mentioned, IU University, PGY 4, thank you for this opportunity. I do have a couple of disclosures. I do have some personally held stock in Johnson & Johnson, which is why these slides are submitted early. More importantly, I am the trainee member of this panel, and I do not have anything controversial. I know this is about the controversies, but this is the obligatory, we need better research, but in better detail. So as mentioned, this is all born from the consensus conference presented last year. There was a lot of discrepancies in terms of the data collected and reported. So my goal is to dig in a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of how do we get more efficient, efficacious data collecting and reporting so that we can make better guidelines. As a review, these were the key questions that we had addressed. What are the necessary studies, or what are the necessary preoperative evaluation? We had surgical versus medical versus endoscopic. We had partial versus complete fundoplication, and then we had a focus on the obese population. So really discrepancies in reportings are intuitively obvious that if you have bad reporting, you have bad lack of consistent outcomes, metrics, et cetera. This is going to affect your data, ultimately your interpretation, comparisons, and your final judgment. So when you make guidelines, it's a pretty long process that anyone that's been involved with can attest to. And if you have lack of good outcomes or good data, that will affect ultimately your data extraction, your quality, and ultimately your guidelines. So when you get your final guidelines and you're looking at this and you're wondering, why is all my data low or very low, or why are we not actually giving strong recommendations? Usually this isn't because there's research out there, but it's not consistent research that can be combined into like one summary statement. So in order to have good research, what do you need? You need data that supports good clinical decision-making. Obviously, this means you have to have the pertinent population, meaningful outcomes, usually comparative data, and appropriate follow-up. You also need good data just from the statistical standpoint, where you have consistent metrics and transparency. I don't care how good your study was, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. What we use for guidelines and for all systematic reviews in general, I believe, is the PICO format, where we say, okay, what do I want to know for my clinical research? I want to know what is the important population, intervention, comparator, outcome. And of course, sometimes you use PICO-T, where you specify the timing. So you go into creating a systematic review, or you go into a guideline knowing very clearly what you want. We had our questions phrased as such. You can see it highlighted here where we had our population, intervention, comparator for all of them. We went in pretty structured going forward. We also then had specific outcomes that we thought were pertinent for that specific question, that we thought that practicing clinicians and the other audience would appreciate. We'll get into it more, but for key question 1, none of our outcomes were actually feasible given some of the data. And so key question 2, 3, 4, et cetera. We had that panel of experts go through and say what is actually important to know going forward. So that's all in all to say we knew pretty much what we wanted going forward. We had a pretty clear idea. When we actually went to the research collection, we did not find things that fit as neatly into our little PICO-T outline boxes. And that's really where the problem is. I'll highlight some of the areas where we did find discrepancies so we know what to correct going forward. There are more examples, obviously, but these are some of the most frustrating ones that were commented on in the panel last year, in the discussions of our actual guidelines, and just during conference calls in general. So for key question 3, which is a review, was the partial versus complete fundoplication. The population issue was that we didn't really have standard definitions of motility, dysmotility, in a lot of our reference studies, and that we often didn't stratify, and by we I mean the literature was not stratifying based on dysphagia. What that meant is that when key question 3A, when you talk about general populations, we had pretty solid evidence. We had moderate certainty in our evidence because we had good data. But when you started looking at people who had esophageal dysmotility, the lack of stratification meant we just didn't have the numbers to create good outcomes. You have a lot less, obviously these are smaller graphs, and it ultimately has low certainty of evidence just because we didn't have that stratification. Also had some population discrepancies in key question 4. This one was focusing on the obese population. So obviously if you're looking at obesity, you want to know what the actual BMI was. A lot of times they didn't have stratification though based on BMI. They just would tell you what the average BMI was, or wouldn't tell you what it was for maybe so those people with a BMI of 35 versus 50. And I think everyone was quite clear during last year's consensus conference that this is a clear weakness in terms of the data that we collect. Also, when you have people who have failed fundoplications, we didn't have a lot of information on, well, how many did they fail and what was their kind of workup prior to that. In terms of issues that we had, so this is saying all in all, when we try to narrow the data, GERD is a huge topic. A lot of people have GERD, and we're trying to, in these key questions, narrow it down to like smaller populations. And often we do a good job. We have obviously the fruit from a cornucopia of GERD data, but at risk of being a little cliche, if we're not paying more attention to details in terms of what population we want, we're ultimately stuck comparing apples to oranges. And the intervention I'll only briefly touch on because a lot of the panelists upcoming will talk about this in much greater detail and with greater knowledge than myself. But for key question 1, a lot of the studies for the preoperative workup, there is tremendous need, this is a quote directly from our guidelines, for the standardized terminology. We wanted a lot more written documentation, actually showing in detail what the workup was. For key question 2, again, you have procedures, and so if you have a procedures, well, how did you do it? Because are you actually doing the same thing? And that gets back to the apple and orange kind of conversation. For key question 3 on complete versus partial fundoplication, again, a couple more talks upcoming, but a lot of people just lump all the partials together, and you want to actually say what type of partial it was or how those might have differed in terms of their outcomes. Comparator is the kind of my pet peeve and my personal goal to eliminate. When you're doing any sort of guidelines, there's a lot of good single-arm data, but you can't really use single-arm data. And so for key question 1, we had all these great ideas of how to choose the perfect workup. And we said, well, either do this or you don't do it, and you see what the outcomes are. But there was no X versus Y kind of situation, so we couldn't do that. And we were left kind of only looking at the single-arm studies. So that giant table of all the perfect outcomes we'd want to know as clinicians was kind of useless, and we were just stuck looking at a couple outcomes in terms of, was there any change in what they did in terms of, did we change our management decisions? There was also some other studies that had limited comparative data. For these, it was really more of a kind of the usual we need more research line at the end of your paper, where we just need more studies on GERD fundoplication versus gastric bypass, and for those with failed fundoplications, because it was just a matter of the sheer numbers were limited that made us have very low data or certainty. And also there was no comparative studies also for our KQ2C group. So outcomes is really the part that most people can focus on. That's what we care about. That's what we want to know will happen in any research study, in any surgery you do, what's going to actually happen. And unfortunately, a lot of the stuff didn't have consistent outcomes. We'd have papers that either just did not report on undesirable effects, they only reported on the good, or they only reported on a couple things like quality of life and cost, or they had other non-informative outcomes. Or for KQ4, which is on bariatric surgery, or bariatric population, they would only have GERD outcomes and not bariatric outcomes. Metrics is probably the easiest one, that when people think of discrepancies and kind of reporting, this is where you can really make an easy outline. You have a lot of different ways you can report the same outcome. You can have obviously qualitative, quantitative. You can have different scales that can lead to things like standardized mean difference as opposed to mean difference if they're all the same scale, and obviously continuous, binary, etc. And you can see here just a little quality of life is often on a different scale, and I can say that no one really knows intuitively what a standardized mean difference means. Maybe the methodologist, but everyone here is used to saying a mean difference. If you say there's so many standardized mean differences, no one really gets that in most calls. So it's kind of nice when you can actually get the same scale. In GERD, obviously the outcome we care about was the worst offender in terms of a million ways in which it was reported, which means it's very hard to kind of collate that together to one outcome. And even when you're looking at subjective and objective outcomes, even the timeline was hard because you have a lot of wonderful data that can go to 15, 20 years out. But if you have like 40% dropout, our methodologists would skewer us alive if we tried to make any meaningful conclusions based on that. So really, and dysphagia also, a lot of mixed ways of reporting. And again, this is not to say there's no good data. There's a lot of good studies out there that could make very helpful support when you're making clinical decision making. This is just in a broad spectrum of, I'm making a guideline, I want to bring it all together and kind of make one summary statement. It's hard to do. So why do I care? Again, there's a lot of very low evidence in those guidelines, and a lot of it could be improved with better, consistent reporting. This is both a call to action and a shout out. This has been done before in other areas. You've had, for example, standardized outcomes reporting in metabolic and bariatric surgery, where they've already done very detailed explanations of what short-term versus long-term should be, extensive definitions of what they consider critical outcomes and what you should do for percent follow-up. So we can really do the same for GERD as what's been done for bariatric reporting, I think. And really, I've already done all the outlining here, what would need to go into it. We've talked about the PCOT, what you need to have meaningful research. We can say, hey, you want to make sure your population is good. Have the key diagnostic criteria for GERD. Make explicit metrics. I showed about 2 slides. We can pick and choose and say which ones are the most helpful and most meaningful. Make sure you outline what the subpopulations of interest are. If you're going to have a bariatric population, include bariatric outcomes, include your BMI. If you're going to do things like dysmotility, please be explicit in what they are and explain what type of partial wrap you have. So again, you can go through all of these that we did in the previous slides, and everywhere that we were frustrated really is an opportunity to outline a little bit better what we can do better. And maybe if we do that, all the phenomenal research that's already going on out there, if it's just reported a little bit better, can help strengthen our guidelines and maybe make a little bit less of those low or very low outcomes in terms of certainty. That's really all I got.